Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. So I was thinking about this morning as I was thinking about Father's Day, and I was actually, texted my father and said Happy Father's Day, and then this little joke came into my mind. Okay, so the parents of a 4-year-old were showing him their baby pictures. After looking at them for a few minutes, he asked, "If these are your baby pictures, where are the dinosaurs?" That's sometimes the way that I think about it when my kids say Happy Father's Day. They think back to my childhood and think that was a long time ago. But those things are kind of almost irrelevant to the things today. But a lot of times then I look at my childhood and think it's not really all that different from what things are today. Because I don't remember there being any dinosaurs in my childhood. We're in Samuel, and we're reading about the story of Saul. And we're looking at his life through a pretty microscopic lens. We're looking at a guy that, most of us, if we lived our lives the way and under the microscope like Saul did, we would probably come up pretty much short, just like he does. But at the same time, we can learn from these things. And so I just want to remind you as we go to 1 Samuel, we're going to be looking at 1 Samuel 13. But I'm going to read the first couple of verses right before we start chapter 13. So this is in 1 Samuel 12, starting in verse 24. And this is what Samuel, the prophet, is telling Saul and the people in his retirement speech. He says, "I'm leaving the stage, and now I'm reminding you of some things, and this is the last thing I'm saying, so this is what I want you to remember." And Samuel says to them, "But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Yet, if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish." This is where we're at in the story of Saul, because we've talked about, for the last several chapters, Saul's rise to becoming king. And we talked about how the people demanded a king and how God wasn't very happy with that. Neither was Samuel, for that matter. But because then God says, you asking for this king means you're rejecting me as your king. But God says, but I'm going to provide you with a king anyway. And so that's what he does. And we see this gradual progression of Saul from as this young man who first is anointed, and then he is chosen by lot, and then he leads the people in battle, and all the people get together and they say, yes, we have a king. And they're all celebrating, and they're all happy. And then Samuel, which is what prophets do, is kind of rain on the parade a little bit and say, yeah, you're celebrating, but realize that at the end of the day, regardless of whether you have a king or not, this is the important thing. Are you going to fear God, serve him faithfully? Are you going to persist in doing evil? And that's the question that we're faced as we're reading this story. And I say this all the time, but it's because I know that you guys don't always remember what I say. But we try to read this story, or I try to read this story with fresh eyes, meaning what's going to happen with Saul. Now, like I said, a lot of times we've already read the story a dozen times. We know what's going to happen. But we need to kind of try to look at it in terms of, is Saul going to be the right kind of king, or is he going to be the wrong kind of king? Is Saul going to fear the Lord and serve him, or is he not? And for that matter, the question, will the people serve God now that they have a king? And so these two questions are the questions that are going to come up over and over again as we keep reading the story. What's going to happen next? Are the people going to start serving God, or are they not? Is Saul going to be the king that God wants, or not? And as we kind of look at that, we look at the story, like I said, and we know the end of the story. We know what happens next, and we know But this is the question also that comes up to each one of us. This is the question we all face, since we don't know what the future holds. And we want to think, oh no, I would never stop serving God. I would never turn my back on God. I'm always going to be faithful. And then we realize that we all know people that would have said that earlier in their life, and now are nowhere near God, nowhere near serving God. They are not interested in what God is doing in their life. And we start thinking, well, that's not us. I would never do that. I would never. Well, let me turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. This is the verse that I read way back. Remember way back when we started Samuel, like 3 or 4 months ago? You remember that? Right. Nobody's putting their hand up, so I'm going to have to go back and preach all of those sermons again. So, but 1 Corinthians 10, this is one of the things that Paul is writing to this church. And he says in 1 Corinthians 10, 11, verse 11, it says, these things happened to them. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the Old Testament stories. He's talking about Saul. He says, these things happened to Saul as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. The culmination of the ages. We've received the Holy Spirit. We've seen the sacrifice of Christ. We've got all these huge benefits. But we can still learn from what goes on in Saul's life. So, if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. You know who's the most likely person to fall? It's the person who thinks they can't fall. They're the ones who face the biggest temptation. Then it says, and this is the verse that usually people start with, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So the promise of God is, I will be with you. If you stand firm, I'll be there to help you. I will. But you got to recognize your temptations. You got to recognize the things that could bring you down. And God says, I will be there for that. But you got to be ready for that test. And this is the question then that faces Saul. Saul has been made king. Well, we're not really sure that he really wanted to be king. We're not really sure that, but he is. And it's good to be the king. You ever heard that?
Yeah.
It's good to be the king. But at the same time, it's going to be a terrible responsibility on him. We just read those verses. If you don't fear God, if you don't serve him faithfully, if you start going the wrong way, you're going to be in trouble. And so this is the question that we're facing with Saul as we're getting into the next part of his story. The next couple of chapters are all about what happens to Saul now that he's king. Is he going to be a good king? Is he not going to be a good king? Is he going to serve God? All of these things are the questions that we're facing. And what we're going to be doing is doing what Paul writes to this church at Corinth. We need to look at his life and not assume that we won't be like him, or we won't be tempted to fall just in his areas that he does. And so, back to 1 Samuel chapter 13, and we're going to see what happens next. And just in good Samuel, the way that Samuel is written, the first verse that we're going to look at is one of those verses that we're not really totally sure exactly what it should say. All right? So it looks pretty simple, but if you have different translations, you'll find out really quickly that there's problems. So in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1, it says, Saul was, or at least the NIV says, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Now, if you have an NIV with you, and I almost did that with this up here, but then I thought that would be too complicated. But actually, the 30 and the 40 both have little footnotes next to them in your NIV. Yeah. And then it goes down to the bottom, and it says, they're not in the verse. Some translations have instead, well, let me read it to you what it literally says. Saul was a year old when he began to reign. And he reigned in 2 years over Israel. The word 30 and the word 40 aren't in the Hebrew manuscripts. Kind of weird that it's fallen out, but it's clear that something was supposed to be there. And so people have put in different words. If you have a New American Standard Bible, for example, it says that Saul was 40 years old, and he reigned for 42 years. If you have a King James Version, it says Saul was a king for 1 year, and then he reigned for 2 years, which they tried to do the best they could with what the situation was. If you really wanted to translate it literally, it would be Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign. And we know that's not right. So what do we do with all of this? Okay, I'm going to give you two different things. One is, real quick, I'm going to read Acts 13:21, which is from a speech by Paul. I'm just going to put it up on the screen, and you can see here that Paul says, the people asked for a king. He gave them Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years. No dispute about that. Where did he get that? And the answer is, well, some of the Hebrew versions in the old times had the word 40 in there, and that's where he got it. There's this historian. His name is Josephus. You may have heard of him. He's a Jewish historian who wrote right about the time of Christ, a little after, right about the time of Paul, really. And he puts in these numbers. So what do we do with this verse? I'm going to compare it to another verse. 2 Samuel 5, verse 4. By the way, this is the kind of thing that I really enjoy studying about and reading about, and some of you are sitting there thinking, we could just go on, I don't really care about all this stuff. But I do, so you get to listen to it. That's the way it works here. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 4 says this: David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. A little similarity there, isn't there? So the words 30 and 40 may very well have been taken from that passage and stuck into this one. By the way, this is what the Bible does whenever there's a king. And when that king becomes king, there's a verse like this. So when we look back in chapter 13, verse 1, what it's doing is it's telling you before anything else happens, it tells you how old the king was and how long he was king. It's not intended to be a chronological thing. It's not intended to be anything other than just a general description of, here's this person, this is how old they were, this is how long they reigned. And it's interesting, you get your concordance out one of these days, look up the word 40, and how often kings and judges reigned or ruled for 40 years. Wow. It's one of those numbers that is over and over and over again. And really what it represents is the idea of a complete generation. That's the idea. Saul was king for a complete generation. All the stuff that we're going to read going forward in this story all happened within that 40 years. And that's an interesting thing about Saul. Saul becomes king, and then he is king for a long time. Did anybody remember what was going on 40 years ago? Yeah. First you're trying to do the math, and you're going, wait, 40 years is... Yeah. Some of you aren't even 40 years old, so that doesn't really help. But, 40 years is a long time. 40 years that Israel wandered in the desert. Joshua was leading Israel for 40 years. Moses led Israel for 40 years. I mean, there's a constant 40. Jesus was in the wilderness being tempted by Satan 40 days, but there's that number again. So we constantly see this number 40. And it represents that complete generation, that complete cycle of, so that when Jesus is tempted for 40 days, it means he faced every temptation he could possibly face during that time. And that's what happened to him. This is what's going on with Saul. I did all of that because one of the things that we have to be careful of is just reading the next thing. Like, when we write a history, we say, okay, well, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and then this happened. And then we waited a few days, and then this happened. I mean, that's how we go. But the Bible tells the story by listing the things that they think are most important and then telling you those things. They're not necessarily trying to say, well, chronologically. They weren't interested in that. What they're interested in is the theological and spiritual implications of the kind of king Saul was. And that's what we're going to be reading about. All right. I'm done talking about that stuff. If you want to know more, and I don't see anybody jumping up saying, yeah, I want to know more, then, we'll talk some other time. So we keep going. Back to 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 2. It says, Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. I'm just going to stop reading for a second because they bring up this guy. Recognize the name there? Jonathan? Yeah. Now, if you've been reading this for the first time, you have no idea who Jonathan is. They don't. The Bible, the story doesn't introduce him in any way. It just says Jonathan. Okay. I'm going to give you a little bit of it's a spoiler alert. Jonathan is Saul's son. So if Saul was 30 years old, that means that whatever's happening here didn't happen at the beginning of his reign. Because if he's 30, there's no way that his son Jonathan is old enough to lead any kind of soldiers, right? So this is down the road a ways. Sometime later. 2,000, 1,000. Verse 3 says, Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, let the Hebrews hear. So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, which is not strictly speaking true. Jonathan did, but Saul's the king, so he gets credit for it. And now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. I just like the word obnoxious. Literally, I think one person said we should translate this as, and now the Philistines smell the rat concerning Israel. That would be a very much more colorful way of doing it. So, and the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. There's this really complicated situation going on here. You've heard of the Philistines, right? We've had battles with them before. They keep coming up. We're going to learn in the next chapter or next week that the Philistines are actually almost conquering and ruling Israel. I mean, Saul's the king of Israel, but the Philistines are a big problem. They've got better weapons, they've got more people, they've got all kinds of advantages over Israel. And so for Israel to attack the Philistines here is a really bold step, particularly with Jonathan only has 1,000 people. You think, and I know what you're thinking because a couple of weeks ago, none of you are thinking this, but a couple of weeks ago we talked about Saul. Remember, and he led an attack against, he was saving Jabesh Gilead. Do you remember that?
Right.
How many soldiers did Saul have? This is like a Jeopardy question, right? 300,000. Now he has 3,000. Something's going on, isn't it? Something's happening here. But they're going to start a war anyway. So I'm going to put the map up just because I know some of you like maps. And I do too, but there's one person that, I just do everything for Susan because, So, this is Israel right here. This is the area we're going to be looking at in a minute. This is Ammon. Last time they had a battle, it was against the Ammonites. You remember that? They attacked a place called Jabesh Gilead, which is way up here. And so Saul marched his army up here and he defeated the Ammonites. Here's the Philistines, Philistia. Down here's the Amalekites. Remember them because in a couple of weeks they're going to fight the Amalekites. Okay? And that's when Saul's really going to get into trouble. But that's going to happen. Now what we want to do is we're going to look at this area right in here. And watch me zoom in on that. Look at that. It's kind of. I mean, if it looks fuzzy, it's not your eyes. The map is fuzzy. But you see, here's Michmash, here's Bethel. By the way, all of these towns are like 4 or 5 miles apart. They're really close. Okay? So, Michmash, there's Geba, this is where the first battle is. Here's Gilgal, where there's the Philistines, and the Philistines are over here. And so, you can see when they gather at Gilgal, they're as far from the Philistines as they can be and still be on that side of the Jordan, right? So that's where they're going to gather. That's where they're going to fight these. And there's going to be all these battles in here. There's Oprah. I don't know if that's named after the actress or not, but it's Oprah. This is Beth Horon. Here's Mizpah, Ramah. And you're going to see, as we read this, you're going to see a lot of little movements in all those areas. But I wanted you to picture that because it's all within like about 20 square miles. So it's not there's not a lot of area there. But there's all this army's going to be marching back and forth, and there's battles going on, and there's all kinds of stuff happening, and it's all in that little area right there. And you can see where Jerusalem is right in the middle, which actually at this point it's just kind of a hole in the wall town. It's nothing until David conquers it later on. It's not any significance at all. It's just there as a point of reference. And you can also see Bethlehem there, which is right below Jerusalem, and that's where David will be born. So you've got all this going on, and it's all right there in this little area, and there's all these battles going on. Verse 5. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. How many soldiers does Saul have? 3,000. Gonna be tough. The Philistines, went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. Here's a little Hebrew lesson. The word Beth means house or home. And so Bethlehem, for example, is the house of bread. Beth-aven is the house of evil or the house of wickedness. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. So Saul has 3,000 men, and what are they doing? They're hiding in holes and pits and cisterns, and they're running as far as they can get away from the Philistines and still be in Israel, basically. So this is not looking good for Saul. I almost couldn't say that. Goes on in the verse 7, last part of verse 7. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. I don't think that we can say it any more emphasis than these last two verses, that Saul's army is not ready to fight a battle. They're not, are they? They are afraid, they are running, they're hiding, everything. So Saul, in verse 8, it says, Saul waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him, went out to bless him, went out to say, hey, Samuel, how's it going? Good, I'm glad you're here, because I already took care of all the offerings and stuff. You don't have to. Now, we can remember back in the previous chapter where Samuel actually told Saul to go to Gilgal and wait 7 days, and I will show up. Now, I think this is one of those situations where this is what they did. Before they were going to do a battle, Samuel would tell Saul, I'm coming to Gilgal, or I'm coming to wherever you are, and when I get there, we'll do all of the offerings that we need to make. Samuel's not only a prophet, but he's also from the tribe of Levi, so he can make these offerings. Saul's from the tribe of Judah. He's not a priest, so he can't. And so the situation is, Saul is looking around, and he's seeing all the problems. The Philistines are coming. My men are scattering. There's all kinds of problems. Samuel, who knows what Samuel's doing? We don't even see him. And so he goes ahead with something that he shouldn't be doing. He should be waiting for Samuel, and he doesn't do it. That's the crux of the matter we're facing right here. It's all going to make sense in a minute, by the way. Verse 11 says, "What have you done?" asked Samuel. And Saul replies, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." I felt compelled. I had to do this. You ever done that in a situation where you knew you weren't supposed to do something, but you looked around and thought, I better do this. I have to do this. It's out of my hands. It's not my choice, but I got to do it. And God is telling Saul, no, you should have waited for Samuel. You would have been okay. You needed to wait. You needed to do what I'm telling you. You need to, in the words in the last chapter, you need to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully. That's what God is going to tell Samuel. That's what Samuel is going to tell Saul. In verse 13, "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. By the way, when you read the word fool, I had trouble with this for a long time, and sometimes I think we all do too, is that the word foolish here doesn't mean silly or like a clown or something like that. The word fool in the Bible means somebody who makes bad choices. That's what a fool means. That's why Jesus says, you call somebody a fool, is just like murdering them. Because you're saying you are a morally unsound person. That's what you say when you're using the word fool. So when we see the word fool, you need to make that adjustment. I for a long time, you think, well, it's not really foolish. I mean, it seems like it's a pretty good idea in the worldly sense, but it's not. It's a foolish thing. Samuel said, "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Wow. God judged him kind of harshly. Now, at this point, that doesn't mean that Saul's not going to be king anymore. He's still going to be king. It's just that his line is not going to continue after him. That's what God is saying. Your family, namely Jonathan, is not going to be king after you. Somebody else is. Now, this is important now. We go back to verse 1, right? How long was Saul king? 40 years. So God doesn't take his kingship away from him at this point. Do I want to spoil it? He's going to eventually, but 40 years he's going to still be king. But Jonathan's not going to be. And Samuel says, you didn't keep the command. Now, if you go back to what I said earlier, Samuel had told Saul, wait 7 days and I'll be there. That's probably part of the command, but I really believe that the command that Saul broke here is what we read at the beginning. Be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. That's the command that Saul broke. He didn't see it in his life that he was just going to do what he wanted to do, and God was expected to bless that. Saul thought, I'm the king, God made me the king, so therefore, I'm just going to do what I think is best at any moment. And Samuel says to Saul, that's not the kind of king we want or need for Israel. You need to fear God and serve him only. A lot of times, and I was thinking about this the other day, but a lot of times when we think of sin, we think of what would be called moral or ethical things. Don't tell lies, don't commit adultery, don't murder people. But a lot of times in the Bible, what's judged by God is not those things, but your heart. Are you seeking to serve God? Are you seeking God's will in your life? Are you wanting to be who God wants you to be? Is that who you are? And that's what Samuel is judging Saul, or God is judging Saul for here. And That's why there's this, I read this, and every time I read this story, I always kind of think, well, come on, I mean, so he waited 8 days instead of 7. Is it really that big of a deal? But it appears that this story is told to us because this is the kind of person Saul was. He just did what he wanted to do and not follow along with what God wanted to do. And that's the issue here. Verse 15. It says, Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him, and they numbered about 600. It's getting smaller. The armies are getting smaller and smaller. Verse 16, Saul and his son Jonathan, this is how we find out it's his son, because it tells us now. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah in Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ogren in the vicinity of Shual, another toward Beth-Oren, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the wilderness. Some went east, some went west, some went north. So the Philistines are basically going wherever they want, and Saul can't do anything about it. We're going to stop reading right there, and if you want to find out what happens next, you have to come back next week. Or you could just read it yourself later on today, but the next few chapters are going to be this constant warfare between Saul, Jonathan, and the Philistines. And so this is where we set it up. The Philistines are basically invading Israel. Remember the cycle that we have where raiders come in and plunder Israel? That's what's going on. And remember that what the people wanted? They wanted a king who would keep these things from happening. So God says, okay, here's your king. Let's see what he can do. And it's almost like God steps back for a second and just says, okay, Saul, they chose you to take care of this, take care of it. And we're going to have to see what Saul does. But while we're thinking about that, I just want to look at a couple of passages, a couple of ideas here. What did Saul do wrong? Saul did not trust God's guidance. That's what he did wrong. This isn't a huge, big, major thing. And for most of us, we think, well, okay, so Saul didn't. But Saul's supposed to be the king. And one of the things that's going to happen as we read Israel's history is the nation is judged by the king's behavior. If the king is following God, then the nation does. If the king doesn't follow God, then the nation doesn't. And this is what happens in Israel over and over and over again. The kings are judged to be faithful to God or not, and therefore the nation follows that. And so as leaders, this is a principle. The way the leaders go is either the way the country goes or is a sign that this is the way the country is going. The king represents the country. So Saul did not trust God's guidance. And a side issue here is, again, it seems like kind of a small thing, right? It's kind of like, but this happens from time to time in the Bible. Remember Moses? Did anybody remember Moses?
Yep.
There's one person back there. Okay, so Moses was leading the people out of Israel. I could go, we'll go back to Exodus and read all of Moses. No, we won't do that. Moses led the people out of Israel, and then they wandered in the desert for 40 years, remember? And then they went into the promised land. And remember that Moses didn't. Why not? Well, he had this time when he was supposed to speak to a rock to get water to come out. God was going to provide water. And instead of speaking to it, he hit it with his staff. And there's a certain amount of, and again, you think of that, well, that seems kind of ticky-tack, doesn't it? I mean, come on. He hit the rock, so what? I mean, is that really worth not going into the promised land? And then we think back to Cain and Abel. You know, remember Cain and Abel? Cain and Abel bring a sacrifice to God. And it's a little unclear exactly what the issue there is, but Cain's sacrifice wasn't accepted by God, but Abel's was. And so Cain, in his wisdom, kills his brother, because that's what you do when God doesn't take your sacrifice. But again, it seems kind of a little bit of a ticky-tack thing, right? Well, I'm going to read to you from Luke chapter 19. And I put up on the screen, the whole story is there, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. And you guys know this So we're gonna have to struggle to find this. But in Luke chapter 19, I was looking at 9, but 19, there's this story. This one's called the parable of the 10 minas, but in other places it's called the parable of the talents. Okay? But I'm going to, this is where the leader, the king, gives 10 to one person and 5 to another and 1 to another, and then they each do things with it, and when the guy comes back, he judges them, right? Remember the story? Mm-hmm. Does anybody remember that story? Yeah. Okay, good. I don't have to read it then, but you have Luke 19, verses 11 through 27. So I'm going to skip down to verse 24, and I'm going to make it hard on Carol to find verse 24. So then he said, so the last, let's start in verse 22. No, we won't do that. Where are you at? Go ahead. Okay, let's start right there. I'm going to read a little bit before this, but it says, the master replied, I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, did you, that I am a hard man, taking out what I did not put in and reaping what I did not sow. Why then didn't you put my money on deposit so that when I came back, I could have collected it with interest? Jesus is telling a story about God, and he calls God a hard man. Then he said to those standing by, take his money away from him and give it to the one who has 10. Sir, they said, he already has 10. Like Jesus didn't know that. He replied, I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given, but as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, kind of a little connection to the passage we're reading in Samuel, bring them here and kill them all in front of me. Now, Jesus is telling this story. Okay, so if you don't like this story, it's not my fault. Jesus is the one who's telling it. And he has this thing about, and he's really basically saying, look, at the end of the day, God is a pretty hard judge. And things that we think are of little account, God says, no, this is significant. Saul is not a person after my heart. And so I'm going to take away from him what I have given him, which is what this story is really about. And it's really about the people too, because that line in there, these enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, that was Israel. That's what God said. They're choosing a king because they don't want me to be their king anymore. And God in a story like this, and Jesus in a story like this says, we need to recognize that God draws very strict lines. And that's important for us to remember. The second thing, what did Saul do wrong? The second thing that Saul did is he shifted the blame to others. See, the army's scattering, and Samuel, you didn't show up on time, and the Philistines are right over the hill, so I have to do this. I have to disobey. I have to go against your will. I have to, because the events of the time are doing this to me. It's not my fault. The devil made me do it. You know that, you've heard that, right? I was put into this situation, and there's that blame. And we're not going to read it now, but I put Genesis 3 up here, because you've heard this story, right? God says to Adam, where are you? Why are you hiding? And Adam says, well, we're naked. And God says, who told you were naked? And then he says, why did you do this? And you know what Adam says? He says, it was her fault. And Eve said, in fact, then Eve says, well, it wasn't my fault. It was the serpent's fault. And even I go back to what Adam said. Adam says, well, it was the woman you gave me. So ultimately, God, this isn't even our fault. This is your fault. See, when we sin and when we go against God's will for our life, that's our tendency. We want to be, we'll be like Saul. We'll say, well, it really wasn't my fault. It was that other person's fault. It was the situation came up. There was just, then we go back to, well, before we do that, what did Saul do wrong? The third thing is, Saul did not look for the way out. What was the Corinthians passage saying? Remember that? We'll put that back up here too. When you're tempted to do something, its promise is God will show you the way out of the situation. Just look to God. God is faithful. He will take care. He will give you what you need to not go down that path, to not do that foolish thing like Saul. And that's what Saul doesn't do. In fact, after we get done with the little story and Samuel says we're going to take, Saul just goes right back to business. He gets his army together. It's kind of small now. There's only 600 of them. But he goes back to Gibeah and he starts doing what he needs to do. It's like he never really changed who he was. He didn't do things differently. He just went back to doing what he was doing before. And a lot of times that's what we do. We don't change. That's what the word repentance really means. When God points out to us and says, look, you're doing something wrong, what do? Well, first of all, it's not my fault. Secondly, I'm just doing what I think is better. We don't. In fact, it's better, God, we just don't talk for a while. Why don't I just go back to what I'm doing? I'll just go back to what I'm doing, and I'll just keep doing what I was doing, because as we know, that will fix the problem. The things that I was doing got me into this problem. I'm just going to keep doing those things until I get out of the problem. And that's what Saul's. And see, that's the picture of Saul that we're going to have now as we go forward. Saul never at any point just stops and says, okay, God, you win. I'll follow you. I will fear you and serve you above all things. But Saul never does that. He never does that. And when we get to David, what we'll see over and over again is that's the first thing that David always does. When he does something against God's will, he repents, and he says, forgive me, God. But Saul doesn't. That's what being after God's own heart is. That was a lot. Some of you are probably looking at that chapter saying, I got all kinds of questions. You know what? Wednesday nights, we have a Bible study, and you can ask all those questions on Wednesday nights. But I just want you to go from here thinking, okay, God can be a hard judge. I need to deal with that in my life. And that's where I want to leave you with that thought this morning. Let's pray.
Amen.